Welcome to KU Padasala. My name is Chad Haag. I am an author and former teacher from the United States of America, and I'm very excited today to be able to speak with you about the fascinating topic of German for reading knowledge. In this 10th and final lecture of this course, we will deal with the very important topics of the passive voice as well as prepositions. I'd like to thank the University of Kerala and everyone who's been involved for a very fun course. This has been a pleasure to teach, and I thank you also, the audience, for watching. All right, so the passive voice is something which you can use as a modification to ordinary word order within, as well as the status of verbs within the language, in order to change not the factual reality of what has happened, it's the same either way, but rather to call attention to one particular participant within the situation over another. Now that might sound like a mouthful, but what I mean there is if you take a very simple example, like saying that the soccer player kicked the ball, that's the active voice, which can be put into the passive voice as simply as saying the ball was kicked by the soccer player. In both cases, in reality, the same thing has happened. In both cases, the soccer player is the one who's doing the action. In formal linguistics terminology, we would say that the soccer player, either way, is the logical subject, but it can change to something other than the grammatical subject because of the phenomenon of passivization. If we passivize that sentence and say that the ball was kicked by the soccer player, now the ball has become the grammatical subject of the conjugated verb was, even though in reality, once again, it's still the logical object of that act of kicking. It's not that passivization changes anything in the real world. It's just that it is used as a tool to call the listener's attention to one participant within the situation over another. Here I want you basically to think about the ball rather than the person who kicked it. This might even be used in willfully deceptive terms to eliminate the agent of the action from consideration altogether. This is used when police are unsure who committed a crime. For example, to say, well, the bank was robbed yesterday. By whom? Well, we actually don't know. That's why we've deleted the agent as a redundancy. Or it might be used in more malicious purposes, such as trying to obscure the responsibility for lost funds within, say, a bank, hedge fund, or investment firm. Well, $500 million was lost. Well, it was lost by whom? Well, we're not going to tell you by whom it was lost because passivization allows us to take the logical subject of the sentence and actually delete them as a redundancy because of the syntactic law that anything which occurs within a prepositional phrase, like we find here, by such and such, introduced by the preposition by, anything occurring within a prepositional phrase is considered redundant and can be deleted. So we see the reasons why one might passivize. But in grammatical terms, passivization is something which is a little bit different in German than it would be within English. In English, you basically use to be as a sort of auxiliary paired with a past participle to change it into the past tense. It is still the past tense kicked in the soccer ball example, but now the auxiliary is was rather than have. If it was the active voice, the soccer player has kicked the ball. If I say the ball was kicked, it's the same participle, but the change in auxiliary from have to be has made it passive voice. And the first time you're learning German, you might think that that's how it's done in this language too. After all, French follows the same convention. Passivization is extremely rare in French, but when it does happen, in cases like the example, the soldier was killed, le soldat a été tué, you might have noticed that we use the verb être, which is to be, as the auxiliary to put it in passive voice in French. But in German, we actually fall back on werden of all verbs. And we learned last lecture that werden is both the standalone verb meaning to become, but it's also an auxiliary which allows you to put something into the future tense. So you might ask at this point, how on earth can we use it for another auxiliary purpose by putting something into the passive voice if it's already been used with an infinitive to form the future tense? Well, the answer to that riddle really comes down to what that second verb within the syntactic formula might be. If the second verb is an infinitive, then paired with werden, it's in the future tense. Okay, but if that second verb is a past participle, paired with werden, we know it's in the passive voice. For example, I can say, dieses Schiff wird von der neuen Firma gebaut. Now, if you look very closely here, the second verb within this formula is not an infinitive at all. Gebaut is rather just that familiar past participle we've already encountered before in this lecture. And therefore, it's really the status of that second verb which will tell you whether you're working with the future tense or the passive voice. Here, dieses Schiff wird von der neuen Firma gebaut treats the ship as the logical subject of the conjugated verb becomes basically werd, but we have this extra prepositional phrase, von der neuen Firma, who tells us who did the building in reality. It was the new company. Now, we might say in English, by the new company, with by as the preposition of choice, but in German, the preposition of choice is not by. It is rather of. So it was built of this new company, and gebaut we know is the past tense because the infinitive is bauen. Similarly, if we were to put this into the past tense, once again, the passive is not a tense, it is simply a voice. Tense tells you about time being past, present, or future. Voice only calls your attention to one participant over another. So we could make this passive and past tense as follows. Dieses Schiff wurde von der neuen Firma gebaut. Here, gebaut remains a past participle at the end of the sentence, but wurde is the simple past tense of werden it's. Now, if we were to try to have a past participle for werden itself, that would be sein, for the reason that werden is intransitive. Now, once again, you might become something, like you might become old as the years pass by, but old is not an object, which is transitively receiving the action of that verb. It's rather more like the equal sign, which I keep mentioning, in which two different symbols refer to the same thing. So it would make sense that if you did have to put the passive voice werden into the past tense, you would use sein to do that. But if you did that, what on earth would be the form of the past tense participle which werden would take? Now, you may know that the normal form of the past participle of werden is geworden. But if it's in the passive voice, the form of the past participle actually makes an exception to its usual form by appearing as worden rather than geworden. To take a concrete example, we have dieses Schiff war, which is the past tense of sein, von der neuen Firma gebaut worden. Here it's in the passive voice, but also in the past tense, because worden is the past participle of the thing that made it passive, but it has been moved all the way to the end of the sentence in accord with the rules of German syntax, even after the past participle of the action we really care about, which is the building, which was done, by the way, by the company, not by the ship, which we know because of the presence of the prepositional phrase von der neuen Firma, which once again would be translated as by the company, but is actually using the German preposition of. Now, what if we wanted, for some bizarre reason, to be in the passive voice, but also to be in the future tense? How could we do that if werden is both what puts it in the passive voice and also what puts it in the future tense? Well, the short answer to that is you would use a conjugated form of werd in the second position to put it in the future tense, but you would also use werden in the infinitive form at the very end of the sentence to put it into the properly passive form. This is exemplified concretely by the sentence, dieses Schiff wird von der neuen Firma gebaut werden. We have two werden appearances here. The first one, once again, putting in the past tense, dieses Schiff wird, and the second one, appearing after the past participle gebaut, which is the action that happened to the ship, appearing at the very end. And so the last topic which we will discuss today is the role of prepositions in the German language. Now, it is sometimes thought that the purpose of using cases is to bypass prepositions altogether. You might hear informally explain something along the lines of, whereas English uses prepositions like to, German can use the dative case and eliminate that as a redundancy, and that is true in that particular context. Similarly, you might hear people say, well, whereas English would use of to show possession, German can simply put it into the genitive case and eliminate the preposition von. That is true in that particular context, but it's closer to the truth overall in the big picture of things to say that German is more complicated in its use of prepositions than English would be, because German still uses many prepositions, but the object of the preposition now has to be in one of those cases, whereas in English, one of those cases of three, I should say, accusative, dative, or genitive, whereas in English, the object of a preposition is pretty much only ever in the one objective case, even in those rare cases where you have to consider case explicitly, as would be the case in, for example, the personal pronouns like me, him, them, etc. So what this really means is that we have to take some time now at the end of this course to formally learn which cases go with which prepositions. And the only way we can really do this is through systematically learning them, having it committed to memory through practically using them. But first we need to know what the prepositions in German are. Now, we're already familiar with some of them. Just as a result of using the German language, you inevitably deal with a lot of them, just in the process of learning other grammatical subjects, but now we'll have a more comprehensive view. So if you look at the graphic on the screen, you can see that prepositions are considered to be oftentimes a way of showing the relation between two different nouns within the sentence. Here we have the one noun, the child, and the other noun is the box. Now, if we're wanting to tell you where the child is located relative to the box, we could use any one of these prepositions, which are oftentimes very similar to the English word. If the child is in the box, we would say in, much as would be the case in English. If the child is over the box, we would use über. If it's next to the box, basically neben, before or in front of the box vor, on the box auf, at the box an, behind the box hinter, under the box unter, and between the boxes zwischen. But there's many more prepositions within German than just that, so we'll have to take a moment to go through this list, which I'd recommend you to write down and to pronounce along with me. An is at, anstatt is instead of, auf is up or on depending on context, aus is out of or from, außer is except, by is with or in the case of or at depending on context, durch is through or by means of, entlang is along, für is for or on behalf of, gegen is against or towards, gegenüber is opposite, gemäß is according to, hinter is behind, in is in, mit is with, nach is to if you use with the place name, or after or according to depending on context. Neben is next to, ohne is without, seit is since or if used with time for, trotz is in spite of, über is over or about or concerning, is around or at if used with time, unter is under or among, von is from or of or by means of, vor is in front of or before or ago depending on context, während is during, wegen is on account of or because of, wider is against, zu is to, and zwischen is between. Now, as I had mentioned earlier, preposition is called that within English because we have an understanding that the preposition is coming before, that's why we say pre, the noun which is modifying, but it wouldn't be a real language like German if there weren't some exceptions to that. Now, it is true that typically the preposition comes before, but there are some cases within German in which the preposition comes after. Kind of a reversal of order, like the image you see on the screen of the man pushing the car, which is something of a strange thwarting of your expectations with regard to the way things are supposed to be arranged there. So a great example of this is entlang. This means along, but whereas in English we would say he runs along the street, in German we say läuft die Straße entlang. Die Straße is the street, and entlang is along, but we're really saying here basically he runs the street along. Diese Familie wohnt dem Hotel gegenüber. So here, opposite gegenüber is appearing at the end, whereas in English we would say this family lives opposite the hotel. In German we say diese Familie wohnt dem Hotel gegenüber. Another great example is nach. to say in my opinion, meine Meinung nach, rather than nach meine Meinung. You could say after that, meiner Meinung nach ist diese Aufgabe schwierig. So once again, we'd expect prepositions to always be before in English, but in German, some of them can come after. Another example of this is wegen, in the sense of das Wetters wegen bleiben Sie zu Hause, because of the weather, or really the weather because they're staying at home. Now, as I had mentioned earlier, it's not the case that German is able to do away with prepositions because it has cases. It's rather that the prepositions become even more difficult to use because you have to know which one of three cases they can be paired with. And the only way to really know this is to study it systematically, but we have to qualify even that by saying that there are some times when either one of two cases can be used, but the choice is not totally arbitrary. What you were trying to say will mean something different depending on which case you use. A great example of this is the verb gehen, and the preposition in can be followed by a noun within either the dative or the accusative case, in which what you were trying to say will be very different depending on which one of those you choose. If you say geht in das Haus with the accusative case, that actually does mean something then if you say geht in dem Haus in the dative. Now, the first time you see that as an English speaker, you might think to yourself, well, what's the big difference? He goes in the house. I mean, it seems exactly the same to you. Well, the difference is that if you use the accusative case, you're emphasizing that there is a change in the status of the subject, which is being achieved through this action of going. In this case, we're really saying that he goes into the house. Before, he was not in the house, but through going into the house, he's changing his status to being on the inside of it. If we're not trying to say he's going into the house, however, we're simply using in the house as some extra information, we would use the dative case. The example, geht in dem Haus, here we're placing the emphasis on the act of going. He's walking. He's been walking for some time, and the extra information with regard to the place of it is, well, it's in the house, but that's just extra information. I'm not emphasizing that he's going into the house or changing his location. It's just, I'm telling you about the walking, and where it's happening is just kind of an afterthought. So once again, we can only really consider the many prepositions and their corresponding cases through learning them one at a time, which we will do right now in a way which I recommend you to follow along with by just copying these, memorizing them, and of course using them. The accusative prepositions are as follows: bis, which means until, up to, or as far as; entlang, which means along; gegen, which is against or toward; which is around, about, or at if it's dealing with time; durch, which is through or by means of; für, which is for; ohne, which is without; and wider, which is against. The dative prepositions include the following: aus, which is out of or from; außer, which is besides or except; bei, which is with or near; entgegen, which is toward; gegenüber, which is opposite; gemäß, which is in accordance with; mit, which is with; nach, which is after or according to, depending on context; seit, which is since or for; von, which is from, by, or of; and zu, which is to or at. Now, the first time you hear about genitive prepositions, that might strike you as strange because we have a tendency to think of the object of a preposition as an object in the sense of either the direct object of the accusative case or the dative object, which is the indirect object. Now, we do have genitive prepositions which take an object in the genitive case after them, but these tend to be things which we would translate into English with some reference to the word of. For example, anstatt is instead of, and it is followed by a noun in the genitive case. Außerhalb is outside of, innerhalb is inside of or within, oberhalb is above, unterhalb is below, diesseits is on this side of, jenseits is on that side of, halber is for the sake of, infolge is as a result of or due to, inmitten is in the midst of, mittels is by means of, notice the word of recurring often here, trotz is in spite of, willen, to show that these are, typically separated, is for the sake of, Während is during or in the course of, and wegen is on account of or because of.